Hi everyone, my name is Echo Swinford. I am a PowerPoint MVP from Indianapolis, Indiana. My area of expertise is actually presentation, and part of that is because I got my start, oh my gosh, 20 years ago. I started in this industry working in a medical education communications company. And I started out working with physicians, and honestly, I had to help them make their charts look better. Now that, as some of you know, is a challenge in and of itself. But because of that, I started picking up different techniques and different, just different ways that you can help tell a story better with a chart and help make it more digestible and more informational at a glance. And so I wanted to pass those along to you. Now, today what I want to talk about is very specific techniques that you can use to improve your charts and your data visualizations. But creating more effective charts actually starts before you even get into Excel. Now, I can show you how to do things like, change colors of a chart or add a data label, but I believe that it is more important that you know what to do rather than how specifically to do it. So, creating more effective charts is really mostly about understanding how your brains parse information. So that's what we're going to start with. We process information through both visual channels and through audio channels, and we can't actually process both at the same time. And in fact, you may not know this, but there are studies that show if you have a lot of text on a slide, your audience is actually reading instead of listening to you. And they recall less of your presentation if you have too many words. The same thing goes for charts. If your audience is trying to wrap their heads around your chart, they are not listening to you. Because our brains are filtering all that sensory information, and only a little bit of it stays in your short-term working memory. And that is really the goal, is to get stuff into your memory. But it's like threading the eye of a needle. And because it is like threading the eye of a needle, you are better off feeding information in small bits rather than doing a huge data dump. Now, this actually leads to something called pre-attentive attributes. And you might expect that those are attributes that your subconscious brain interprets instantly. They're pre-attentive, before you're paying attention. So your audience actually sees a graphic and their brains are working before you even get started. And you can leverage those to your advantage. If you use pre-attentive attributes, you can guide your audience and help tell your story. Pre-attentive attributes are rooted in Gestalt theory. And I talked to some of the other MVPs, and some people like to talk about Gestalt theory and some people don't. And I just want to touch on it briefly because it really does have a lot to do with perception, and it really does help inform those pre-attentive attributes. So Gestalt theory was developed in the 1920s, and it was a group of psychologists studying perceptual organization. And really what they were doing is they were trying to figure out how our brain organizes information and how it perceives both the parts and the whole of an object. And what they found is that we subconsciously segregate and group all of this visual information in order to perceive it as a whole. So I guess you could say they found, the whole is more than the sum of the parts. You've heard that. I think that's pretty much the crux of the situation here. But the upshot of it is a simple, well-defined object will communicate much more quickly than a very detailed object with a hard-to-recognize contour. There are more than 100 Gestalt principles, but some of the ones that I've shown here, some of them are especially relevant to data visualization and to making effective charts. So think about these and consider these as you are creating your visualizations. Bigger background, proximity, simplicity, look for focal points and emphasis. We're going to talk about all of this. So like I said, Gestalt principles lead to pre-attentive attributes and pre-attentive processing. And these are the visual cues that your brains start noticing and sorting out before you even realize it and before your audience even realizes it. So where am I going with this? It's like Gestalt principles, pre-attentive processing, like what's the point of all of this? This is the stuff that our brains are doing. This is how our brains are processing and what is going on in our head whenever we look at a graphic. And I want you to make no mistake, a chart is actually a graphic. It is a graphical representation of numbers, and if you do it right, you can help your audience very quickly understand your numbers as well as your main point, so they get your story, if you will. Now, if you use Gestalt principles and pre-attentive attributes, you will end up with a chart that is what my friend Nolan Haynes calls glanceable rather than referenceable. And that's really the overall goal. You want people to be able to understand your point at a glance rather than having to study a huge old spreadsheet or a big complex and confusing chart, and then they come away with a completely different understanding than you might have expected. So I always encourage my clients to think about their charts as billboards. Now I know that's really simplistic, but seriously, if you look at this, which one is going to make you want to eat more chicken? I'm thinking the billboard, eat more chicken, the Chick-fil-A cows. The takeaway here is get to the point and don't be afraid to tell your audience what the point actually is. Here Here I went ahead and plotted the spreadsheet that you see on the right. And even though it's not a billboard, I think when you compare the chart to the spreadsheet, you can still see how a well-conceived chart is more like a billboard. It gets your message across, and it gets it across much more effectively than just a big sheet of numbers. And that leads me to emphasis. I want to talk about what you need to do to make that happen. How do you get that billboard look? How do you make sure that your audience is not just seeing a sea of numbers and they find what's important in your chart? Well, one reason you find one chart more effective than another is because of something we call emphasis. And you can leverage those Gestalt principles and those pre-attentive attributes, and that lets you emphasize whatever point it is you need to emphasize. And what I always tell my students is when everything is bold, nothing is bold. And that's what I want you to remember when we're talking about emphasis. So type in chat for me. You can type in, I think it's in the Q&A that you can type. So type in chat for me and tell me which one of these is more compelling. Which slide is more compelling, the left or the right? It's not a trick question. Throw in some information for me. Which is more compelling, the left or the right? And I see a couple of things coming in. Okay, good. Exactly. The one on the right, the one with the big black block, that one is definitely much more compelling than the one on the left. And why? It's because of contrast. That's really the crux of the subject with emphasis is contrast. And Robin Williams, she is the author of the Non-Designer's Design book, says that by its very nature, contrast calls attention to itself. And that's exactly what happens here. Because it is contrasted, it is emphasized. And there are a lot of different ways that you can create contrast. And I want to do a little exercise with this ad. Now, if you would pull your answers in chat or in that Q&A panel, I would appreciate your feedback here. But what I want to know is, what do you look at first when you look at this ad? Need some feedback here, need a little interaction. What do you look at first when you look at this ad? And again, it's not a trick question, but you know, magazine ads are really great for using different ways to create contrast. And so I'm just trying to get a sense for what you look at first. Anybody? Starting to see a couple of things trickle in here. Do you look at the shoe? Do you look at the big text in the left? Do you look at the little red lines over here? What is it you look at first? The headline. Most of you, a couple of you are looking at the headline, good, and a couple of you are looking at the shoe. Exactly. Now, there's no right answer here, and that's kind of the point of this exercise. And I know it's a little unusual in a webinar to ask you guys for feedback, but it does help me because what I see is everybody looks at something a little bit differently. The thing is, you are looking at the sneaker because it is the biggest, boldest thing on this slide. It is huge and it is right in the middle of the slide. You're also, some of you are looking at the headline first, right up here, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, again, because it's big and bold and huge. It is the most contrasted place on this slide. It is very, very big black text against white or very light gray background. Now, you can also say that you read the headline because you start in this upper left corner. And there are different theories about where you start reading in an advertisement or on a page. One of the theories is says you read in a Z, and so you go from the top left over this way and then down to the bottom left and then over to the bottom right. Another theory says you go across like a T. And so there are a few different things, but a really talented graphic designer can lead your eye through an advertisement, which is really kind of cool. Now here we're also seeing contrast of size. So we see contrast with, contrast can be size, it can be shape, it can be color, it can be positioning, it can be so many different things. But I think that size and color are really two of your most effective strategies for creating emphasis in charts. And you can see the size, especially right here, but also color, black against white. Now, when you create this, when you use this contrast and you use sizing and positioning like this and color, you're also creating a hierarchy. And so you know that this big, bold text up here is what you're supposed to read first. Even if you look at the shoe first, you know what text you're supposed to read, what is the most important thing. And you know the name of this shoe immediately because you've read that text. So that's a good example of emphasis and using color and size for emphasis. All right, let's try another one then. Let's take a look at this one and do that same little exercise. This one's a little trickier. What do you look at first when you look at this ad? What do you think? There are a lot of different things going on. This is not as clean as the big Nike sneaker. Any ideas? What are you looking at first in this one? Do you look at the car? Do you look at the text at the bottom? Are you looking at the logos in the upper right? Maybe that small tagline on the left? I'm seeing that most of you, I think most of you are looking at the car, and I see quite a few of you are looking at that text at the bottom, the introducing the all-new BMW 7 Series. Now again, there's no right or wrong answer. And this one is actually a little bit muddled compared to that really nice, clean sneaker ad. And it's not as easy to tell here what you're supposed to look at. Now, I think there might be an argument for Z order where you're reading from this top left because you've got this white on black, so highly contrasted, and then you're looking over here to the white, which is highly contrasted, and you come down here diagonally and then left to right across the bottom where you're reading the white. So there might be an argument for that Z order, but really, honestly, overall, I would encourage you to be like the shoe, not like the car. This one is a little tougher because your headline is down at the bottom, and your car, which you're supposed to look at, you can tell. I mean, it's right in the middle and it's huge, that product shot right there. So it's effective, but it could be more effective in some ways, I think. So don't get fancy with your charts and your labeling is what I'm saying. Put those headlines where they need to go and think about color and contrast, color and size. All right, here are a few ways that you can create emphasis in charts, size, shape. You can do saturation, which is kind of like color, I think, but position, color, etc. Again, I think size and color are really your go-tos. Now, when you are creating emphasis, the other thing I want you to think about is what's in the background and what's in the foreground, because your background stuff should fade into the background and your foreground information is what's important, and it should be more saturated or colored or more prominent. So you need to think about background information versus foreground information. And that leads me to when everything is bold, nothing is bold. Now, I used to see charts like this a lot more often than I do now, but I think it's still worth taking a look at this type of chart because you do still see things like this. Remember, I told you, I always tell my students when everything is bold, nothing is bold. And this is really an example of someone not understanding how to create emphasis, and so they kept throwing more and more and more onto the chart, trying to make the data stand out against all of those crazy grid lines and all of the text everywhere, and those, you know, the legend and the chart title being in there. And they're just trying to even make it visible and readable, and it's almost impossible. And I have to tell you a little story here, because this actually reminds me of my mom's couch. Now, I know that sounds a little weird, but my mom got this new couch. And I walked in one day, and there were 8 million pillows on this thing. It's this red couch at the end of the room, and it looks like just this huge hulk because there's all these pillows and blankets and stuff on it. I'm like, Mom, what is up with these? And she said that she felt like the couch was just a little bit too big for the space it was in, so she was trying to hide it with the pillows. And I'm like, all right, let's try the opposite. And so we stripped everything off, and it wasn't nearly as bad. It didn't look oversized at that point, and it fit the room just fine. And so this is my mom's bold couch. It's like, again, someone doesn't know how to create emphasis or work with it, so they just keep piling more and more on and making lines thicker and darker and bolder, and just eventually you just don't know where to look. So here's a better version of this same chart. You can tell what to look at here immediately. It is so much better and so much easier on the eye because not everything is bold. You know immediately what's important, and you can pull out the story from this graphic. So again, when everything is bold, nothing is bold. Think about what you're doing when you're creating contrast there. Another thing that you want to consider is your color choices. Now in this chart, we already know, the chart on the left, we already know that these individual bars represent different countries. And so we don't need to color them all differently because of that. When we vary all of these colors, it visually separates each of those bars, and it makes each one look different than another. But really what we want to do is we want to encourage people to compare the countries and to see the ranking pattern they form as a whole. So in that case, it's better if they look alike. It's usually better if you have all of your bars like this in a single series, the same color, so that they do get compared rather than with different colors. Because then when we see different colors, we're wondering why things are colored differently. Is there a point to it? What am I supposed to be taking away? But if they're all the same color, then you know that you're supposed to compare them as a whole. And then I would suggest that you take it a step further and you emphasize one important point. And this goes back to that pre-attentive attribute with saturation and another way of creating emphasis, color and saturation. So in this case, we've grayed out everything here. It is one whole because everything is grayed out. But right here, we've created color, we've added color and or saturation to this one data point. So we know that Australia is important in this data set, and that is what we want to talk about. It's a lot easier to see that in this third chart than it is in that first one with all of the different colors. I think that it's probably obvious to you. You have to be careful about using too much color because it's visually overwhelming and it makes your eyes tired. And if you use it gratuitously, you undermine the ability to use color to make things stand out. Now you can see here the red alerts really stand out in that chart on the right in contrast to those neutrals. But on the left over here, they're kind of lost because there's a lot of meaningless, colorful information here. You don't have to label all of the greens, all of the yellows, all of the reds. Label what's important and what you need to call out here. So less is more when it comes to color. Anybody have any questions? And if you do have questions, we're keeping an eye on the Q&A panel. So if you want to type in there, if you have any questions, we'll go ahead and take those. Windows logo behind the car is intriguing. I just saw that. You're right, it is. All right, and I'll go ahead and start talking about chart junk while if you have questions about color or anything, seriously, put them in the Q&A and we'll try to address them as we go on. All right, chart junk. Do you guys know who Edward Tufte is? Edward Tufte is, he's kind of, I would call him the godfather of data visualization, but he coined the term chart junk, and he defines it as anything that doesn't help in understanding. And that's because when you have too much stuff on a slide, your brain just can't process, and it has no way of knowing what's important. And so your job is to help your audience understand what is important before they're even actually actively thinking about it. Remember, it's those pre-attentive attributes. If you Google chart junk, these are actually some of the examples that come up. And yeah, I gotta say again, I don't usually see chart junk, quite this extreme, but it's still helpful to look at. It really is. So what would you consider chart junk here? Do you have any thoughts? I mean, remember, anything that doesn't help understanding. Any thoughts? What would you consider chart? I mean, obviously the bananas, those are chart junk. I mean, who needs a big wall full of bananas behind this chart about banana exports? But some things on here, like this extra legend right down here on this sales chart in the right, it says % of sales. And that's chart junk too. That can be a chart title, that could be a slide title, that is one series. So you don't need a legend that says % of sales. The numbers are percentage, it could say sales quota up there, or sales actuals or whatever. Now, those are extreme examples, definitely extreme examples. And I see some of you are laughing at these, and yeah, those 3D effects are pretty crazy, like I said, extreme. But sometimes it's not so extreme. Sometimes it's like this, and I see charts like this all the time. I don't see banana charts and crazy 3D, but I do see stuff like this. So type in chat, what could we remove here? What would you consider chart junk here? And remember, chart junk is anything that doesn't help in understanding. This one's a little tougher because it's not so obvious what you could remove. But if you look at it, I think you'll see some duplicate information, and I think you'll see some stuff that doesn't help with understanding. All right, so legend. The legend is redundant, absolutely. So thank you for calling that one out. January through January through July, we have it right down here, and we also have the legend. We don't need the legend. It's better to label it directly under each bar. What about months, the word months here? I think January through July is obviously months, so I would take off the axis label right here. And same with average income. We have average income per month here. We have average income down the side. I know it's average income. I get it. It's average income. Any other thoughts? Too many colors, the legend for sure. Absolutely. Too much colors. You guys are exactly right. So thank you. You're paying attention. A couple of other things. So we have colors on the bars, like you just said. There's this weird shadow right here around this plot fill that we don't necessarily need. And I'm going to tell you guys, we also have a shadow on the legend. Now, if you get rid of the legend, the shadow is moot. But if you're going to have a shadow on something, I'm not anti-shadow. But if you're going to have a shadow on something and you're going to add a shadow to something else on your slide or in your chart, make sure it's the same shadow. So what I always say is one light source. Because right here, the way we're looking at it, we have a spotlight over the top, and then we have a spotlight over the left shining down. And I mean, that's just one light source per chart, please. And one light source per slide when you start working in slides. So think about those shadows. Extra zeros in the axis also. You can use number formats in Excel to drop out those extra zeros. So some of those types of things you can consider. And it's a little harder, and it's not as obvious, but it will make your chart better. So you can get from there to this, and you can do that really easily. Too many colors, let's emphasize what's important. We're going to drop out and gray out everything else. Very easy to get from this to this. You just have to think about it and be aware of it and think about all that pre-attentive processing that's going on. And if you want to take it a step further, you can even just add data labels right here and remove the axis over on the left. Usually, if you have data labels, you don't need both data labels and an axis. Now, I can't say that's always true, but it is something to consider. You may not need that axis. So you could always take it a step further like that. So you're going from lots of chart junk right here to a cleaner chart that tells the story immediately, and it's not really difficult. You just really, like I said, think about your story, think about what it is you need to emphasize, and then just remove all of that clutter that surrounds it and help your audience understand what it is that they need to look at. All right, I'm looking at the chat. Anybody? The whole legend, the shout. Yep, you guys are right on. Nice, good. Glad to see that. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about labeling and titling now. This is something that throws people. Don't make your audience bounce back and forth between a chart and a legend. If you can label your chart directly, please do. And I'm showing this in pie charts just because it's a really easy, obvious way to show it. But this goes for almost any chart. You'll see a few different kinds here. Don't make them bounce back and forth between widgets, spinners, G-jaws, thingies, sprockets here. They're going back and forth. And this takes away from the glanceability of the slide. You want people to be able to, again, pre-attentive attributes, you want them to be looking at it and understanding it, so they're listening to you and not trying to figure out what's going on with your chart. So the less they have to work, the more they're going to pay attention to you. Even over here on the left, I've put in the percentages, but I've left the actual labels up here. Don't do that. Just put the whole darn thing on here. And yes, you can do some inside and some outside. That's okay. But just try not to go with a legend. Whenever you can direct label, I would encourage you to do so, because I think that you can see how much easier it is to immediately, at a glance, see what each slice represents here on the right much more quickly than you can with the one on the left. Again, like I said, inside, outside, both are fine. And yes, you can mix them if you want to. Like these widgets, 54%, this could go inside, spinners could go inside, and the other three outside. That's not a problem. Now here we're looking at a line chart, and sometimes you might think that if you put the legend over on the right instead of up at the top. Now up at the top, I think you can see that you're bouncing back and forth. And so you might think, I'll put the legend over here at the right and it will be a little bit better. I personally think this is a little bit mind-bending, because if you look at it, this widget sprockets gizmos is actually out of order from the lines, from the end point of the lines. It's in order based on the starting point, but not on the ending point, which is usually where my brain is focused in. And so that makes it a little harder to parse. And again, remember that threading the needle. If your audience is focused on trying to interpret that kind of stuff, they're not listening to you. So go with something like this, where you have direct labeling, and it's much easier and much faster to read, and that helps us get to that glanceability. Quick understanding. If you direct label, you can also gray out all of that stuff you don't want to emphasize. Now here we've leveraged all of those pre-attentive attributes. Your audience knows at a glance what's important without even thinking about it immediately. There is absolutely no question. But also I want to remind you, don't forget about your chart titles. Now sometimes if you're doing a presentation, you can forego the chart title and you can actually put that information in the slide title. And you can even put subtitles in a smaller font beneath the chart title if you need to add more information. But this is taking a page from the consultant's playbook. And what they say is that chart and slide titles are always written with a takeaway. So think about your takeaway for your audience. What does it matter? Why is this important? What's in it for me? What is the point? For example, if you saw this slide, what would you say the point is? I'm going to let you guys type in chat for a second. What's the story on this chart? If you saw this, someone emailed this to you, what would you say? What's the story? Is it sales are seasonable? Seasonal? Sales are seasonal? Q1 sales, they were the pits. Sales skyrocketed in the fourth quarter. And we're on a roll, we're on a roller coaster. You could do a lot of different things with this. Don't leave your audience hanging. Tell them what the point is. Tell them what the story of that data is. Help them make sense of it quickly. And the last thing I want to remind you is that sorting your data also helps your audience parse the information more quickly. In this example, you are looking at a couple of counties and you cannot easily tell which one is second. And so again, your audience is not listening to you because they're looking for their county and they're trying to compare second to third, which is not obvious. Here, it's very obvious. Millard is a little bit higher than Beaver. So think about that. Sort your data if it's sortable, and that will help add meaning to your data. Now I want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what kind of chart. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail here, but I think it's an important thing to consider. And I think that we forget sometimes, because I think column charts are usually the go-to, and you almost always, a bar or a column chart, which I will use interchangeably here, one's horizontal, one's vertical. But, you know, bar charts are a go-to because you can, you know, you rarely go wrong with them. But in this case, I have this data displayed in two different ways. And I think that you can see that the chart on the right displays the shape of change through time much more clearly than the chart on the left. You know, the bars work really well for comparing individual values to one another, but the lines really do show shape of change through time. So you can really see how things have changed over that period. Now, which one do you use? You know, it depends on the story that you're trying to tell. What is important about your data and what's the story there? Now we see combination charts. This is the same data, and we see this type of chart fairly frequently, but this does show it a little bit differently also. You do see those individual points, and because you have a line, you see that shape through time, but it is a different look, and it's different than just a line chart. Now here's another option, and in this case, this is actually a column, it's a combo chart with columns and lines, and in this case, instead of using these circular markers like this, we used a dash marker, and we increased the size to, I don't know, 40 or 50 or something, so it's wider than the bar. And it's really just a variation on that combo chart, because then we removed, you know, the connecting line right here. And so this is really great for emphasizing those monthly forecasts, like how are our actuals compared to our forecasts. And I think that that helps emphasize those forecasts. So you're telling different stories depending on what you're doing with your charts. I also want to remind you that just because it equals 100% doesn't mean you have to use a pie, and people get locked into this. Now, this is way, way, way too many slices for a pie, but I know that we see this kind of stuff all of the time, so I thought I would just do a series of charts showing you some different options for this. One of the first things is go for a column chart. Like I said, that seems to be a go-to, and you rarely will go wrong with a column chart specifically. But again, you don't have to go with a pie. Now, if you want to, down here in the corner, you could say something like, you know, data totals to 100 if that's important. But doesn't this help you see that data better? You can compare it much more effectively than you can with that pie chart like so. You can definitely see how cats compare to dogs much more easily there. Fish, they're huge and easy to see there. But here's another option, a stacked column or bar. You can go horizontal or vertical, and you know, just simple labeling across the top. But again, that does help you compare, I think, a little better than with a pie. But if you really want that sense of a whole, that 100% whole, these might be an option for you. Tree maps are also an option. Now, in this case, I think it's a little difficult to compare cats and dogs here, because I've got one that's really long and narrow and one that's square. So sometimes it just kind of depends on your data and whether it works really well as a tree map or not. But I do like these as an alternative to a pie. It's a little different, but they're very, very easy to understand. And usually we configure the area, our brains parse the area of squares a little more easily than the pie slices in the circles. What about a tree map? Now, this is something that my friend Nolan Hames, I mentioned him earlier. I asked him to do a presentation for the Presentation Guild. He and my colleague Julie Turberg do a monthly webinar called Inspired by Design, and I asked them to do something about alternatives to pies, and this was one that he brought up that he uses, the waffle chart. And I love waffle charts. They're great if you have just 2 or 3 pieces of data. I wouldn't go for many more than that. In that case, you would want to go for a series of them, something more along these lines. But again, this is a really, really great way to see that one piece of data compared to the whole. And it's a nice alternative to a pie. And I'm seeing more and more of these in the wild. So you will start seeing more charts like this and more things like this as people are trying to bring more visuals to their data. But just be careful that you're not distorting your story. And remember, think about all of those things that we just talked about with the pre-attentive attributes and what you want people to look at and helping tell that story to make sure that you are choosing the right chart. I mean, just because it's a cool looking chart doesn't necessarily mean it's helping tell your story. Now, these are some rules for using pie charts. The ones on the left are from Ann K. Emery, and she has a really great blog. She talks about data visualization. I love the way she walks through, like, here's something I did for a client 5 years ago, and oh my gosh, I look at it now and I would totally change it, and here's what I would do and why. If you're interested in this kind of thing, highly recommend subscribing to her blog and her newsletter. But she has these rules for pies, that they are well formatted, that, you know, no 3D, no exploding slices, no crazy leader lines, no legends. Make sure that you are using nominal variables, basically survey data, things like that, first, second, third. Those should not be in pie charts. Make sure your pie charts add to 100. I think we all know that, but we see rounding errors sometimes, and if you manually add data labels, sometimes those don't get changed. No negative numbers in pies. I personally have never seen that, but I think it's a good rule. You know, ultimately, you cannot compare pies. You can't compare pie to pie to pie. I'll show you a couple of examples of that. But those are some of the other things that you want to keep in mind. Now, a couple of others to add is that I would say no more than, you know, it depends. How many slices? 4, maybe 5. Ann Emery, I think she says no more than 3. I think 5 is pushing it. If you are getting into too many slices, you need to definitely look at a different type of chart. And we just ran through a whole bunch of different options that you could use. So think about different ways for that. But you want to sort your data in a pie so it goes largest to smallest starting at 12 o'clock. So those are a couple of rules to add to hers. So examples, no exploding pies. This does not help the user understand, and this would fall into the Edward Tufte chart junk realm. Adding to 100. Here are a couple that I have seen in the news recently, actually. If you are plotting survey data, do not use a pie, and especially if your audience or your survey takers can, if they can choose more than one answer, a pie is definitely not the kind of chart you want to use. So I don't mean to pick on the pie too much, but I do want to give you options here. Talking about choosing the right kinds of charts. So just think about these. Ordinal data, ordinal variables, they have a natural order. So like survey data, it goes from strongly agree to disagree. So try to pull that order in. If you have something like that, a stacked column could work really well. Or, you know, even your column chart with a histogram type look. But consider using those. If you really want to get the idea of the whole across, the whole pie, the whole set across to your audience, then go ahead and make sure to use a stacked column because that gives that sense of the whole. And like I said, it is very difficult to compare one pie to another. So you might consider doing something like this with a series of stacked columns, because this is a lot easier to compare the data for women versus the data for men when it's set up like this than if you have a series of pies. And another chart type that I'm seeing more and more now is, this is one that Edward Tufte invented. So he's doing all kinds of things. He's calling out chart junk, he's inventing new chart types. Slope charts are fairly new, and I'm seeing them more and more in the wild. This is a screenshot from Bloomberg.com where I saw a series of slope charts. And the thing is that slope charts make it really easy to compare a beginning point and an end point for, you know, multiple products or multiple companies or countries or whatever at the same time. It's kind of it's kind of a cross between two different column charts where you're swapping back and forth. You're swapping your data back and forth on that XY axis. And so it's just a really super great high-level overview. I like slope charts a lot. I'm liking them more and more. This is the same data that we just had in the slope chart. So let me back up. Here's the slope chart. Here's that same data as pies. This is really, really difficult to understand and to see change over time. And you can see that very well in the slope chart. I think you would agree. This is not This is not a good set, and I see this stuff all the time. Do not do this, please. It doesn't help your audience. And again, they're trying to figure it out. They're not listening to you. So here's that data on the left, and here's that slope chart on the right, so you can kind of compare here. Now, especially, like, look right here with Singapore. It goes from 10 to 1, 10 in 2008 to 1 in 2018 on this expat survey. And so here it goes from 10 to 1. Well, you know what? It's even worse because 1 is good here. Like, this is satisfaction. It's a satisfaction survey. So 1 is great. They went from being 10th to being 1st. In the pies, it looks like they're doing worse because they have a smaller slice of the pie even. So think about those kinds of things when you're pulling together your charts and figuring out how you want to display them and what you want to do. Now, slopes versus pies, more slopes versus pies. Donut charts are super popular. Donut charts are just a variation on a pie, and I like them because you can put total, or you can put a call to action, or whatever in that sexy little circle area. That's great. But this one, I found this on John Peltier. He's an Excel MVP. I found this on his site, and these donut charts were actually published in The Economist. And I have a hard time believing it, that this made it into a publication, because these are so bad, you guys. These are so bad. You cannot compare pies and donuts like this. I mean, here's the data over here on the right. Now, Asia Pacific, like, you get no sense for how much it skyrocketed here, going from, 19% to 54%. Like, I can't even find Asia. Here it is, Asia Pacific. Here's the blue, here's the blue. But I just don't see it readily. I don't see how much it exploded. And Western Europe going from 46 to 6.3, I do not see that here. Like, I have to look for it, and it's not apparent. And again, you want to be glanceable, at a glance. Make it obvious for your audience. So you could use a slope chart for something like this. Now here, I put the chart title over here as the subtitle for the chart, but immediately you see Western Europe going down, and you see Asia Pacific just skyrocketing here. And it's immediate, and it's at a glance, and you can compare all of the countries to each other, and you can compare the beginning points to the end points. And so I think it's a very elegant solution to something like this. Can you see how much easier that is, and how those pre-attentive attributes are coming through, and how you're able to leverage those to help show that story and help with understanding? I hope. Now, remember this. One thing about this that I'm not real crazy about is that these bars, that column chart is kind of crowded, and these bars are, they kind of all run into each other. Now, part of that is because I have two charts on the slide, and there's not as much room to expand it out, horizontally. But that's the case. I mean, we often run into that where we're showing side-by-side charts, and there isn't a lot of room. And sure, I could close up the gap here, and I could increase the gap, or I could make the bars smaller. But if you get much more data than this, you are just really going down a rabbit hole, and it's not glanceable. It's not easy to see the story. So I showed you this as an option. This works better in that smaller space, I think. I also showed you this, where that's a variation on the column plus a line, and that emphasizes those forecast numbers. This is actually called a bullet chart, or a variation on a bullet chart. And this is another variation on that bullet chart. So instead, in this case, instead of using a line chart with dashes and markers, what we've done is we've overlapped one column with the other, and we've made that back column wider. So the forecasts are wider. Rather than being a dash like here, it's pulled to the back and made a little bit wider. But that's another nice way to compare the actuals to the forecast. Now, how we did that, you would think that you could just take a column chart and you could overlap the data series, but you can't. So if you want to create something like that, what you want to do is use your combo chart tool in Excel and plot whatever data you want on top, plot it on the secondary axis. So I want actuals to show up on top, so I plotted them on the secondary axis. And then you can change your gap width to make the one in back thicker and the one in front skinnier and things like that. You'll want to make sure your axes are the same if you're going to do something like this. But that's how you can create a bullet chart very quickly in Excel. So another type of chart, and hopefully a couple of new ones. And that, my friends, brings me to the end. Remember, the most important thing that will help you make an effective chart is knowing the point that you are trying to make. And that helps you determine what you need to emphasize in order to help your audience. I can't really help you figure out the story of your data right now and right here, but I do hope I've helped you learn some specific techniques that you can use to make those charts more effective. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.